This is Art 3. I'd like to begin with a sentence or two from Kandinsky, not from his Concerning the Spiritual in Art, but from the sequel to it, written because people said, we don't understand what you wrote. The very first thing when you express something new is people say, what? They don't hear you. They don't understand you. And you know that it's new because they didn't hear it. And so Kandinsky wrote Point and Line to Plane, following, and it was published in 1926. And after he finished his little section on point, which we'll come back to in just a minute, he began a section on line. And he records this: the geometric line is an invisible thing. It is the track made by the moving point. Now, most people think of a line as connecting two dots. You have two dots, you connect them with a line. And in order to make that line right, you have a ruler and you draw the line across on a ruler. This subconscious scenario is responsible for more errors than any other mistake in the history of the human race. Because out of this episode of misdefinition comes the whole notion that somehow there are rules which govern geometricity. And so when you use geometry as a referent for rationality, you have to have rules. None of that is true. For instance, you don't need to have rules. You do not need to have even geometry as the referent. Chemistry is as good a referent as geometry for order. And a line is not made by a ruler between two dots. And it isn't so much that it's a dot, but we use the term point, and you could augment that by a term focus. Because a point can occur even to its vanishing. Imagine a point blown up to this size. Imagine a microdot which is blown up on the microfiche screen. And you can shrink that, and that dot can be shrunk down to a vanishing point. Once one has the concept of a vanished point remaining a focus, you're capable of a completely new quality of thought. For instance, when you come to the mathematical basis of Einstein, behind Einstein is a very intelligent Italian, Tullio Levi-Civita, in his little book on the absolute differential calculus, the calculus of tensors, which was published in the late 1890s, has a great deal of discussion on the way in which a vanished focus is essential to understanding the way in which a differential calculus unfolds. And we'll come back to this after the break. We'll make our way there. What's important for art, for the artist, as Kandinsky writes, the geometric line is an invisible thing. There are no ruled reference which you must then follow. There are no models which you need to keep in front of you as arbiters of your composition, as rules for the way in which the art is created. He writes, "The geometric line is an invisible thing. It is the track made by the moving point, that is, its product. It is created by movement. The line is moving, it's movement, specifically through the destruction of the intense, self-contained repose of the point. Here, the leap out of the static into the dynamic occurs." So if you conceive of a point, here's a point perfectly positioned. And in order to see that point, it has to have a context, a background. And as soon as you have a background, that point becomes a form. And what Kandinsky is saying is that one can have a centered background context such that the point becomes tremendously powerful and is statically there. What he doesn't say at this particular moment is that if you take the frame of attention around that centered point and you move that square of background contextual space, and you move it to the side and down and leave the point where it is, the point then gains a kind of attention vis-a-vis that square. And only when it is perfectly centered does it seem to have a staticness, which if it moved then would shift to the dynamic. But actually, centering a point within a context exactly produces 180 degrees the opposite effect. If you have a point centered exactly, precisely within a square context, it doesn't occur to be static, it occurs to have tremendous energy. If you stare with natural eyes, with eyes used to looking at things, at a point that's perfectly centered, it tends to drift. It tends to want to move around. If you look at that point with an inner attention, not with natural eyes, but with inner seeing eyes, with an interiorized sense of sight, the point will not tend to move around, but it will tend to vanish. It will tend to look like it is a blank canvas. It is pure context. It's all white. What happened to that dot? It vanishes into its context. The fact that this happens, the fact that it can happen, is a very revealing fact about our nature and about transcendence. It's very revealing about the structure of consciousness. When one looks exteriorly with your vision to see, we look with a stereoptic pair of eyes that focuses. And in fact, that focus is on a very, very small area. It's actually a point. And if you were able to analyze what you're seeing, only the center of your external seeing has a focus, and the context more or less is fisheye lensed away from that. And the context is always integrated into what one sees in the focus. So that the very act of natural perception has a geometric composition in its procedure. Seeing naturally is always a perceptual composition, but is not creative. It's a composition of focus, and of focus that allows for a centering of what context would be. So what you see is actually the point of the context of the picture. So that if you're really refined in natural perception, you become rather Homeric. Homer is the first artist in the world that not only noticed, but was able to utilize as an artistic technique the fact if you start a scene, an episode, with the center of the focus, and then allow the scene to flesh out in terms of the fish-eyed peripherals of that focus, you will end up with a completely clear, imaginative image of that picture. Whereas if you work the other way, if you work from the context towards the focus, by the time you get to the focus, the center of that scene, you have no clear image of the context. In modern cinema, a really great filmmaker will begin the picture of a scene that they wish to show by having the focus of that scene occur first. And only by continuing to watch, by continuing to participate in the perception, the act of perception, the act of the composing of the perception, as the camera goes on, as it moves, as it creates the resonances of the context from that beginning, one then gets the scene. One gets the picture. And in the imagination, the image of that scene will be very clear. For the Greeks, 3,000 years ago, the Homeric act of perception introduced the quality of not looking at the volume of a thing, but looking at the outline of a thing. The outline was the moving line. And the whole notion, the whole Greek notion of logical definition was that one had moved along the boundaries, and having completed the shape, one knew what it was. A definition is the movement of attention along the boundary of a shape until it's completed. And out of this came the very simple beginnings of the logic of definition. Not just definition of a shape, but definition of a word. You say something and someone says, define that. And in logic, when you say of a word, if I say the word perception, you say, well, define perception. You expect me to use other words and other language to draw an outline around the shape of the usage of that word. Hopefully we don't get into an infinite regression by then saying, well, define each of those words. And define whatever words you use to define those words. But in the definition of a word like that, one loses a great deal of what is important. Inflection makes a great deal of difference. The sound of certain words whole as in a whole as in all of it, sound the same. And along with homonyms and synonyms and many other kinds of functions of sound and pronunciation and so forth, inflection, just defining a word is not very adequate. But the basis of the flawed mind throughout Western history and its retuning to accuracy, which is the complementary characteristic of Western history, all centers around mistaking a kind of a geometricity as the arbiter of clarity. And one then depends upon a correspondence between word and thing, an external referent, which matches up in terms of their shapes, in terms of their definitions, in terms of their boundaries. One says in geometry that the word and the image of the word and the thing, that all three of them have a congruence. Their shapes fit. It's a match. Ah, that's what you mean. There's the thing, here's the word, here's the image. Oh yeah, all the shapes match. It begs the whole issue that one could not even function on level of matching shapes unless one had already assumed the whole process of line definition. And the line definition comes from beginning with a focus and allowing for the context to play itself out. So that this entire procedure becomes capable of being shortened to an nth degree. Like in Zen perception, there's no distance between thing, word, and image. It's all there now. Where is that now? In Zen, the now is not in the word. One doesn't say a thing. It's not in the image. There is no image because there's no mental screen upon which to play an image. There is then only the thing. The Zen perception of the rock is the rock. It is only the rock. But a curious thing happens. If one is looking at a rock in its context, and one focuses exactly on the rock as a point, the rock disappears into its context. It no longer is there. Hence, the Japanese koan, form is emptiness. And its converse, emptiness is form. If one went in Kyoto to the great monastery of Roanji that has the raked sand that looks like water waves vibrating around irregular shaped stones, big rocks that look like islands of rock in a raked ocean of sand against a blank back wall, and one sat there in deep meditation, if you continued to see those islands of rock amidst that ocean of sand, this would be very, very poor meditator. When one is precise, when the point is reached, the point vanishes. It vanishes into the context. Not only would the stones vanish into the sand, but the sand vanishes into the seeing. So all that occurs is the act of seeing. No object is there, because one experiences that you are absorbed You are absorbed from the context to the point, but the point reabsorbs itself in the context, which if the context has been absorbed into the point then is absorbed into nothing, into what's called shunyata, into emptiness. That one continues this process of seeing exactly in this mode is a great surprise. The absolutely great surprise. That reality continues to register with exacting certainty, even though there is no image there, there's no word there, there's no object there. There's only the act of seeing in a vanished mode. If one were later, several days later, wishing to sit someplace else, let's say along the shore of Lake Biwa, and try to see the shape of the lake, and you remember sitting in Roanji, and you remember that experience. What happens is that there is a very accurate image in the imagination of nothing. But the imagination cannot make an image of nothing. What would occur for that meditator is the memory that there was an image of nothing. And that memory of the image of nothing occurs with precise certainty. Now, the content of the imagination is nil, whereas the content of memory is full. That produces a second very great surprise. That not only is this so, but that this is operatively so all the time. It's just that in an untrained way, one never noticed that this was exactly what always occurs. Now let's come back to Kandinsky for a moment. Let's come back to a point. Not only does Kandinsky give us a nice little point, like just a point. The camera can come in and see this nice little point here. But that a point can be a whole collection of points, making a point. In physics, this is known as Hamiltonian space. One can work with a set of points as a point and have a whole new kind of geometry. One then has possibilities of structure which would never occur in a Euclidean geometry. In a Euclidean geometry, a point is a singular point. In Euclidean space, there is only one point, and even in that space, that point vanishes. In a Hamiltonian space, one has a set of points that constitute the point. And they create a complex geometry that even begs the term geometry. So that one would then call such a geometry a differential geometry. It is no longer integral, but it's differential. Its basis of mode does not come to a focus which vanishes so much, but its mode works 180 degrees different. It doesn't vanish, but it proliferates. So there's such a thing as a differential Zen master who doesn't see nothing but sees everything. Who sees a point that is so rich and so full and so differential that everything is there. Its set, its field of points within that point becomes infinite. One of the best examples of an artist who stumbles upon this, about 30 years ago, the Russian poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko, who occasionally, from time to time, would anger the authorities for the Communist Party in Moscow, and they would punish him by sending him to Siberia. Only it was a couple of generations out of date. The Communist Party never learned. They banished him to Siberia like they'd been banishing people to Siberia for about 100 years. And it turns out that Yevtushenko was born in Siberia, so to him, they were just sending him home. And home was like a beautiful place. It wasn't like Moscow at all. It was fantastic. The woods spreading for thousands of miles, the animals, the healthy people. And they built there on the great Angara River, runs through Irkutsk, where Yevtushenko grew up. They built a hydroelectric station. The dam with the big turbines at the bottom of the plunge of the Angara River falling over this dam, inside the dam. And Yevtushenko, at one time when he was exiled to Siberia, he went touring the hydroelectric station, which was new at the time. And all the people called it Bratskaya, brotherly station. And he wanted to see why do they call this brotherly station? And he realized, and he wrote a whole poem about it, that this hydroelectric station was different from the pyramids of Egypt. That the pyramids of Egypt were like these monumental things built by slave labor to be statically there, whereas the hydroelectric station, also built by slave labor, but when they were finished, instead of it being a place of repose for one guy, the head honcho, that this whole thing made electricity, which made light and heat for everybody. Brotherly station. And he went to the bowels of the station. He went down into Bratskaya's dynamos, and he heard the sound of the enormous half-mile wide waterfall plunge of the Angara River turning those turbines. And the hum of that river in those turbine modes vibrated so much everywhere that when he was writing his poem, he got completely stuck, or he got completely vibrated on the word that translates as everything. And in the poem, he's writing along, and all of a sudden he comes to a point where he just repeats it. Everything, 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 everything. He got the differential allness. He got the light and the heat, not the stasis of the center of the pyramid for one guy, but he got the light and the heat for everybody for as long as it happens, differentially complete. Everything, 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 everything. And he says in the poem, that's the sound of truth that he heard, and he came to understand. And when he came out, he looked with that differential allness point, and he looked around and he saw that life can be seen with those eyes, and that there are no doubts whatsoever that all of the forms, sociologique, politique, logique, all of the iks are completely cardboard props that have nothing to do with reality. Nothing whatsoever to do with human reality, with human nature, with human potential, on any level whatsoever, that they are bad stage props. And it turned out that 30 years later, Yevtushenko would stand right next to Boris Yeltsin in 1991 when Yeltsin just went out and stepped on the front of one of the tanks that had come to intimidate him. And he said, "Go home," to the Russian army. It's a question of human beings. It's not a question of fighting. And it was Yevtushenko who helped him up onto the tank. It's this kind of quality of understanding reality that not only completely is sinking the phony history that we inherited, is completely submerging all of the dictatorships that have been plaguing us, but is completely revealing to us a landscape that can only be characterized. My friend Peter Rader wrote a beautiful film about it, a water world. A world in which the ocean of perception has just submerged all of the phoniness, and all that's left is just an allness. An ocean of possibility, of newness. Of newness, not that it's new things, but just newness per newness, per se newness. There are no things. And what's more radical, there is no context that will allow things to come back. There are no little hooks or pegs upon which to hang things or the definitions of things. Those also are gone. Now, the fact that this hasn't registered in education is just proof that most education is several hundred years behind the times. They're several hundred years behind the times because 300 years ago, in fact, 340 years ago, 340 years, if you make 20 years to a generation, that's 17 generations of men and women ago. Already, John Amos Comenius could write something like this. A glorious work of God is the world, which makes visible the invisible things of God. A glorious thing is our spirit, which is gifted to portray through thoughts within itself the world and all creation. A glorious thing is speech, with which we paint the great pictures of our spirit on the thoughts of our fellow men. A glorious thing is the letter, wherewith we catch and permanently fix fleeting and transitory speech. Glorious things are the books created from the letter, through which we transmit knowledge to persons separated from us in space and time, and even to unborn generations. A glorious gift of God is the invention of the letter by which books can be speedily multiplied. Comenius, 1657. And Comenius proceeded to make the world's first differential textbook. It was called Orbis Picturis. It's called The World in Pictures. And it was meant to, and did, train grade school children. Comenius is the one who made grade schools. He made grade schools that went from 1 through 12, so that you could replace the kind of old-fashioned 12-part structure that was there in astrology, or 12-part structure that was there in disciples, or 12-part structure that was there in months of the year, with 12-part gradation of working from basic points, the hand, the finger, the eye, the tongue, basic images that you could give to first graders and take them through all the 12-phase form until they were able to see the entirety of the world as an image. That the world as a whole was also an image which was completely understandable and completely real. That there was such a thing as the whole planet. And a mankind that was able to go from first grade to 12th grade and begin with the focuses of images like eye, hand, tongue, orange, apple, and phase form that 12 stages to seeing the completed world as a unity. It was then that they were given a graduation. They were graduated out of grade school when they could look up from the complete world as a completed whole and look at the cosmos and see that also was an even larger whole. That boys and girls were matured to where they would have a cosmic vision of wholeness with as much certainty as they looked at a hand. Camilla said such a population of people will make a completely new world. That they will not waste their time bickering with their fellow spiritual beings on the basis of 1,000-year-old politics, based on 2,000-year-old psychology, based on 3,000-year-old sociology, based on who knows how many thousands of years of flawed way of seeing. That was 340 years ago. We're living at a time where an education like this is simple, standard ABCs. But it's not an ABCs that leads to something which is cognizable in terms of the old. And so a lot of times when I use a language which slurs and blurs, it's not because I'm being imprecise, but it's because I'm being precise in a new way. I'm encouraging you to participate with an active, creative perception. I remember standing one time in the living room of our San Francisco apartment in the 60s. My roommates were the Steve Miller Band at the time. Boz Scaggs had just come back from Sweden bearing a sitar, and he and Steve Miller were trying to figure out new kinds of chords to express a new kind of rock. And Chuck Berry was there, and he said, "The trouble with you white boys is you're trying to play all the notes. Doesn't matter what instrument." He said, "Miss a few notes." He said, "If the audience is with you, they'll fill in. Then you got music. Then you got rock. Then Johnny B. Good comes alive. Roll over, Beethoven. Tell Tchaikovsky the news. They're rocking in 2 by 2. Let's take a break. We have a quality of very high intelligence in our century, but most of it is flawed. It's very difficult to learn anything that's new because we're not prepared to be prepared. And there's a quality of recursive ignorance that just seeps in, and it's very difficult to deal with. And it becomes apparent when one looks at oneself, which is why you have tremendous advances in very limited segments of application, and the people who are making those advances know very little about themselves. They know more about you than they do about themselves because they have all kinds of measurements which they apply to you. And this is a kind of an insane world. It's a world of Kafka, who woke up one morning and had trouble turning over because he looked down and saw he was a great big insect laying in bed. Here's a book published by the Tate Gallery in London, one of the best galleries in the world, for art. Towards a New Art, the Background to Abstract Art. takes the years 1910 to 1920. One of the quotations that occurs in this volume, very early on in the introduction, is this sentence: "By the beginning of this century, artists had been struggling for hundreds of years to represent what they saw about them." My comment? No. No. No artist ever represented what he saw about him. It never happened. This deeply flawed aesthetic is a dream from which consciousness needs to awaken. Do you remember in the film Dune, Paul Muad'Dib's father says the sleeper must awaken. How? How does that happen? By new experiences. And the wonderful Polish actor Jurgen Prochnow says in this deeply moving segment of his role as the father of Kyle MacLachlan, he says, new experiences jar something deep within us. Something gets put into motion. Juices start flowing. As long as experience is able to be within certain forms, it tends to have those forms fill the entire picture. It's like if you set a blank sheet of paper in front of a neurotic and a pencil, and you start talking with them, they will start to make little squiggles and doodles. And if you hit a really deep current of their neuroses, the more squiggles. And if you get really on track and online, they'll fill the whole page. It's like that for someone who would come into this lecture now without any preparation, without any build-up, without any context, without any sensitizing. Immediately, their mind would fill completely with the droodles of association that are triggered, that are engendered by the kind of language that I use, but they would not hear the language that's here. It would be filled with associations. It's no different. The same population of people, the same person, if you sit them in a comfortable chair and you put on high quality CD system, a piece by Beethoven, they will not hear the music of Beethoven. They will be filled with associative qualities of imagination. And depending on whether those are pleasant or not, they will like the piece or not. If you play for that same person a string quartet by, say, number 2 by Schoenberg, they will immediately turn off. They will hear nothing. They don't care for this at all. This is stupid in modern music. It's abstract. If you sit them in the same chair and you play for them a recording of an Indonesian gamelan orchestra, they will get spaced out. Takes a couple of minutes. And they drift into spatiality. They don't have any images for free-form vibration at all. This quality of experience is reductive. The key to it is the way in which we use the term representation. The classic term in Greek is mimesis. We get the term mime, mimesis, representation. And the first writer to sort of put this hook there in art was Aristotle. His theory of poetry is that there is a mimesis that goes on. The artist represents reality by his images. And these images are good images if they do a good job of representing. They're very bad images if they do a poor job of representing. But Aristotle's theory of poetry, his theory of fine art, his theory of representation of reality, is all conditioned by Plato. He studied with Plato for 20 years. He only stopped studying because Plato died. But he misheard Plato. But Plato himself is set within the Homeric aesthetic. The whole Homeric aesthetic that we talked about briefly this morning, of the line outline. The line outline giving shape, of giving us the certainty of form, that the beauty that's there in an image is that it's clearly defined. About 200 years ago, there was a British artist named Flaxman who went to Greece and tried to recover the Homeric aesthetic, and he came back with beautiful line drawings of classical Greek things. And right away, Flaxman's line drawings were understood by the British artistic public as being an ideal. This is what we wanted after all. We wanted clear outlines so that the things themselves would be exacting. And out of Flaxman's line drawings of Homer came two completely different artistic expressions. One of them was the development of a kind of a ceramic based upon Flaxman. A man named Hosea Wedgwood made Wedgwood pottery. And the first great piece of that, the Portland vase, had these Greek classical figures in white against a nice blue background, almost like a blue screen background. And there were these clear, pure, classical Greek figures. This was beautiful and has remained an ideal ever since. The Wedgwood pottery is like an archetypal example of the Homeric clarity, of the image having a very clear outline so that the form is pure against an infinitely accepting context, which allows it to be only what it is, exactly what it is, and only that. Exactly at the same time that Hosea Wedgwood was doing this with Flaxman, William Blake was rejecting all of it. We don't want nice, pretty ceramics. We want to have vibrant, energized images that bring the energy of the cosmos into play in our lives. And so Blake was not interested in nice line drawings, though he took Flaxman's line, but he gave it a vibrancy that was not there in the Greek ideal. He gave it a vibrancy so that the line became expressive of almost like the cacophony of vibrations that would be around a form. His ideal was not the Greek temple, but was the Gothic cathedral. The Gothic cathedral, whose quality of defining space is not the geometricity of the structure imposing itself and portioning out exactly, but of a space which was ascendant, and as it ascended, it transcended. And so the lines changed as they proceeded. Instead of remaining in focus, they went progressively out of focus on purpose to release energy. That for Blake, the line was a volcanic vector into the cosmos. One looks at the Portland vase, one looks at the Flaxman line, it is quietly self-contained. One looks at a Blake figure, and it's like fire. Human figures are like flames trying to burn themselves out of the confinement. They burn through the space into some transcendent differential realm, into a vision, a visionary realm. And in a visionary realm, representation is always a reduction. In a visionary realm, what is operative is presentation, not representation. Presentation, which expresses, and expresses in particular at its most vital stage, the artist, the person. A later genius in art who took the Flaxman line and gave it a Blakean energy was Henri Matisse. One looks at Matisse's lines, and they have the parsimony of a Flaxman, but they have the incredible transcendent vibrancy of a Blake. One can go crazy looking at Matisse sketches by trying to reproduce them. To try and do Matisse lines when you are not Matisse is truly an insane kind of undertaking. Until finally one just simply wants to sit there and let the Matisse lines carry you. Turning the Matisse line inside out was the great sculptor Rodin. Rodin, who could draw sketches, the erotic nudes of Rodin that have appeared in book form, look very much like early Matisse. But those erotic Rodin nude Matisse sketches were all made to be turned inside out to become sculptures, and the Rodin sculptures are very much like three-dimensional Blakes. A Rodin sculpture is not content to be in the polite space that it is. It wants to burn out that context and go everywhere else. So that if you are able, for instance, here in Los Angeles, you can go to the garden of the County Museum of Art, and there's some Rodins there. And I believe that there's a copy of the great Balzac, Rodin's Balzac. Not a gentlemanly figure who belongs in a parlor, but some kind of transcendent specter who, phantom-like, is trying to show you that you're in a realm of nightmare disguise. And that he is warning, he is cautioning you against assuming that you are at home where you are. Rodin's Balzac, like a Blakean illustrated page, is a kind of transcendent Gothic energy inviting you to get out of the space that you think you're in. That as long as you're content to belong where you believe that you are, you will never know that the belief is in error, that that space is phony, and that you yourself have not yet appeared. And so on every level, the movement of definition is an error. And that one becomes, in retrospect, absolutely thankful to the body that it was completely neurotic and refused to accept this kind of life. It wasn't that the body was wrong by refusing to accept this kind of life and therefore must be anesthetized by medication, but that the body was right, and what should be anesthetized is the stupidity that tried to blame it on the body. Oh, you're feeling anxious. Oh, you're feeling nausea. Of course the body feels anxious and nausea. You're nauseating it. You're creating anxiety for it. There was a wonderful talk one time by the Hollywood Tibetan guru, Chogyam Trungpa, who once said, people think that they fight because they don't understand each other, when the actual fact is they fight because they do understand each other. And they don't like each other. I get who you are very clearly, and I don't like you. That's why we fight. It's like that inside-out quality is true of nausea, of anxiety, of ignorance. It's not that the body is ignorant. It's not that the body is making the anxiety. It's not that the body is making the nausea. That the body registers it is simply because the body exists. It's the level of objectivity. And so that scenario that's playing itself out has to register someplace. Why doesn't it register in the mind? It does register in the mind as long as the mind has a screen. Long as the mind dreams that it has a screen, then those images project and they register just like a little movie house in the head. But that screen is just provisional. That movie house in the head is only provisional. You have to remind yourself to believe in your mental neuroses all the time. You have to recreate it. That's why you go over it and over it and over it. The body doesn't have to go over it. It gets it one time and it never forgets that that's really what's going on. It's nauseating, it's anxiety-ridden, and it's ignorant. It's the only place that it can register. The body and the mind are objective places. The only other objective place that it can register possibly is in the person, in the artist. And so when someone begins making art, then the nausea, then the ignorance, then the anxiety has an alternative. It doesn't have to go to your gut. It doesn't have to go to your dreams. It can go to the work of art. It can go to the sculpture. It can go to the painting. It can go to the building. It can go to the costume. It can go to the play. It can go to the novel, to the poem. And if one is becoming an artist in life, it then goes into the life. And one can objectively see that this registers there. This is what's happening. Why is it happening? Because this is what is real. The flaw that hooks this again and again, like some macabre knitter that keeps knitting nightmares. Knit one, purl two. Constructing nightmares continuously. That saboteur is always convincing itself that representation carries itself mechanically all the way through all the phases of development, when representation only occurs on the ritual level. It's only in ritual that representation happens. Already, on the mythic level, images don't just represent. There's always a creative perception that's going on. And certainly by the time you get to symbols, symbols never represent. Symbols present, and what do they present? They present themselves. Emerson, somewhere in his letters, said, we have a great deal of difficulty appreciating ourselves because the symbols are larger. Our own symbols are larger than the lives we allow ourselves to lead. So that the only way to really finally get that symbols are presenting themselves are to enlarge one's life enough so that you become larger than the symbols which are operative. You have to live on a broader, deeper, richer scale than what your mind is able to idealize. Because ideas never represent scenarios in nature. Ideas already are an integrated interiorization of meaning, which has been brought together very powerfully and has begun to transform. On the mythic level, in experience, one has images. One, in fact, can use such a term as an image base. Once, about 30 years ago, I used to help students get this by taking little Xeroxes of various images that they liked during the previous several months in the course. And then we would reduce these images down to card size. And then they would carry this deck of their own images that were card size around as their own individual tarot deck. But the tarot deck had no distinction between major and minor arcana, and it had no suits. So that they would have this packet of cards of little images, and one of the assignments at the end of the symbols course at that time, in the early 70s, these were not intellectual geniuses. They were Canadian men and women, and they're anywhere from 18 to their early 60s, who were trying to just simply get educated. And it was almost inevitable that they would seek to order those images that they had, their own individual tarot decks, their image base that had been engendered just by simply excerpting from time to time their life process in the course. They would take this image base and they would try to arrange it in terms of a typology. Almost never was it arranged in terms of a chronology. Almost never. The typology is characteristic of the struggle of vision. The chronology is characteristic of the struggle of history. That it doesn't matter eventually about what category these images fit into, as finally it becomes important, when did they come out, vis-a-vis the others. It can be a completely arbitrary time in terms of its place. What is the time? The time is within the course. Whenever that course happens in a life, well, that's arbitrary. Why are you taking this course now? It happened that way. You can go deeper into it, but that's like a cosmic kind of a level. But what becomes important eventually is a typology based upon time sequencing. Because it turns out that the dynamic, the differential dynamic of that energy, of that point which is not statically there but is energetically there, its energy is because it has a place within an assumed composition. And its dynamic is the moving vector of that assumed place in the composition. The body has an assumed composition from before birth, by the way. It's there in that life. It used to be called by the quaint little English term character. And if you think babies don't have characters, you haven't been around babies. Babies have very distinct characters. You can spot a trouble causer at 3 months. You can spot an angel at 1 day. There are some babies that are just totally angelic. There's no doubt. And there are some that are pool players. Character. What in Buckaroo Banzai, John Lithgow says, character is what you do in the dark. You see? The body knows the character because the body is the existential objectivity of that character. What else is it going to be? It can be someone else if it has a provisional integration to the point to where it can begin to be differential. Then a whole other set of problems come up. Instead of the problems being to find out who you are, then the problems are differential to find out who you could be. The neurotic thinks that they have really big problem in figuring out who they are. They haven't even faced the much bigger range of problems of figuring out who you could be. The great actor has a tremendous challenge because the great actor can be an almost indefinite number of people well. And it becomes problematical sometimes to remember your character. That's the body's. This is the basis of a great deal of Shakespeare's later dramatic attention and sense. The cosmic actor who is struggling to remember who this body is in face of the differential history that one finally becomes interested in exploring. In art, the focus is upon the artist who creates that art, not by representing, but by going through a phase-form differentiation of what is presented there already on level of symbols, already on level of mind. But the art is drawn from the vision. It's drawn from magic. Art emerges out of the magic process, out of the visionary process. And that visionary process is like a glow, it's like a radiance, it's like a splendor that were one to be ultimately accurate about it occurs out of the vanishing point. That there is so much intensity in the exact centered point of the composition of the body, the canvas, the square of white canvas, which is the body. The centered point, which is the fulcrum of the character. where that character is completely centered in the body as the complete square of attention, then one comes to a point that's not static, but is infinitely energetic. And if one concentrates upon that, the character disappears into the body, but the body has already disappeared into the differential. And so one gets this kind of magical realm. And the artist comes out of that. If you talk about, let's think of a painting for a moment. If you talk about some element, let's think of, what's a famous painting that you might know? Let's think of, do you know one of Rembrandt's self-portraits? Rembrandt has a painting of himself when he was a young man. Saskia is sitting on his lap, and all of his antiques, which he bought at auctions because he had all kinds of money to burn all around him, and he's raising a glass of beer that was like one of these yard glasses. You know, stagecoaches used to pass up this glass of beer to the riders up on top, and they has to be glasses about 20 inches long in order to reach up all the way. And so Rembrandt is hosting Saskia on his knee, and he's lifting this yard beer, and he's smiling. If one looks at this and says that such and such an image represents, well, that glass represents the glass that Rembrandt actually owned. Yes, he owned it. Yes, he bought it at auction. Yes, it was taken by creditors and it was resold. And yes, it surfaces, and one can even find these objects. But in the painting, the image of the glass is not representing that glass. It's presenting the glass that's there for Rembrandt in the portrait. That portrait of Rembrandt is independently real of the man Rembrandt who turned to dust a long time ago. But you have to be very crass to say that Rembrandt is dead. No way Rembrandt is dead. Every time one looks at a canvas of Rembrandt, Rembrandt comes alive in that moment and is there. All of the play of his personality, all of the play of his character is there in that painting. One can come to know Rembrandt. I know him very well. One can come to know Beethoven. One becomes friends with these artists. They become the population that inhabit the differential cosmos. How are they not going to be there? Only if they are forgotten. Only if they are not seen, not met. The fact that out of 5.5 billion, there might be only 2,000 or 3,000 people who look at a Rembrandt and see Rembrandt doesn't mean that this is a negligible process, even if there was only one viewer. It would be a triumph of creativity that the entire cosmos applauds. Heaven is filled with the cheers of the angelic choirs because someone is real in this way. But also they're going to cheer that you got a bigger paycheck. On what planet did you do it? In what star system? In what galaxy? In what dimension of what universe? It's paltry beyond belief. It's nonsensical, finally. It's trivial to the point of nonsensicality. Whereas there is a great resonance of art throughout the entire cosmos. Every instance of it records as a note of joy. One not only sees and hears that cosmic joy, but that it in complementarity, fuses back into nature, so that nature itself is glorious because of that. Why does the process of nature always scintillate? Because it receives that joy. It's a very difficult connection to make until one looks at, say, a work of art like one of the plates of William Blake from the book of Job. It's the 14th plate. If you look at the tarot deck, the 14th major arcana is the Temperance. The nude lady of the world who's able to pour the healing waters back and forth. So the ecology of the flow of the juices of creativity are operative. And in the 14th of the major arcana of Blake's book of Job, one finds the plate called The Morning Stars Sang Together. One sees this great quaternity of angelic figures with their arms around each other and their wings spread wide, hymning the joy of the cosmos. The energy from that joy is what drives the plants in the spring to come back and blossom. What drives the reincarnation of spirits coming back into bodies and forms? Where does that energy come from? Where else would it come from? So that there's an ongoing ecology, but it's a double ecology. The esoteric way of presenting it in alchemical times was the pelican, the mother pelican that uses the flesh of her own breast to feed the young. That they become capable of maturity because they have been fed the substance of the mother. The universe uses its own substance to feed its differential children. That's how the transformation happens. That's how it keeps its tone and keeps all of a piece. An education that is capable of maturing you will flow through this entire double cycle. If it stops somewhere in that flow, that's where the energy backs up. It's like in the Chinese medicinal way of looking at the body in terms of Tao, medicine, in terms of qi. If the qi is blocked, that's when disease happens. The cure is not to take some kind of pill, but to use the acupuncture to open that blockage so that the energy flows along those meridians. One can take an electron microscope and look at the body down to the atomic level. You never find a meridian. Yes, the body is structured by those meridians, but it's differentially structured by those meridians, not in a material sense. The flow is not blocked by materiality, it's not a little brick wall. One would not come to liver 36 and say, well, there's a little brick wall inside the body there, stopping the qi from moving on that meridian. That's a reductive mentality. That's a representational orientation, which is ignorant, stupid, and gratuitous. Ask the body itself will tell. The blockage is there because of a movement which has been tied into a knot instead of letting the contour flow occur. Now, one of the most peculiar things about differential geometry in a differential geometry, straight lines always seem to curve. When Wallace Stevens was writing his great little essay on a theory of art which is entitled The Necessary Angel, he talked about one of his favorite artists, Paul Klee, who was a friend of Ernst and Kandinsky. He knew them both very well. And Wallace Stevens said that he understood Klee to say that he lived in a universe so large that straight lines are seen to fall. That his scope of space was so great that the geometry of ruled lines was unable to hold its energy of deception. That deception lost its energy and power to coerce you simply because of the vastness of the scope of possibility. And that because Klee lived in a universe so vast that ruled straight lines are seen to fall, that he saw organic shapes everywhere instead of the cookie-cutter tyrannies of geometric impositions that caged prisoners receive from truncated traditions and poor educations. Stevens then wrote a beautiful poem called The Good Man Has No Face. And in the poem, he even says towards the end that many people will say this phrase, the good man has no face, as if they knew. What Stevens was saying was that you, in your reality, on the level of the artistic differential person, have, instead of a mask or even a series of masks that are various feelings or that are various ritual comportments, are various images, that entire wardrobe of masks are able to all be taken off, and still you will be there. That the excising of the mask, no matter what it is, does not efface you from reality. The good person has no face, not in that they are a blur, but they are an open possibility. They can be whoever they would like to be or need to be, given whatever situation is drawing their attention. So when Moses, trying to cover himself as he always did, asked the burning bush, well, when I go down and tell the people all these things, who shall I say sent me? And the burning bush says, tell them I am that I am. Actually, the translation of the phrase means, I will be who I will be. When they say, who sent you? Tell them, I will be who I will be. Never you mind. Don't try to make some graven image of God that then you could say, oh yeah, that guy, oh yeah. The long white hair, yeah, up in the clouds, yeah. On the beryl throne, yeah, oh, that guy. Oh, well, what did he say? It's like a Billy Crystal monograph. It's not that guy. And the surest sign that you can have is that if you have an image, that was the wrong guy. That if he gives a mask, that whatever mask it was, if there's an image of it, that was the wrong image. The proof is that there finally comes to be no image whatsoever. And that there is no image means that there was no way to represent But the phenomena of presentation exceeds the capacity of representation to fill it. That representation as a content which fills gets exhausted, but that presentation does not exhaust itself ever, is like one of those little proofs. It's one of those indications for someone who is sensible about proof that reality is not dependent upon whatever color or whatever form one is pasting on it. And if you're trying to fill the available space of presentation with adequate images that represent certain things, one is playing a variant of pin the tail on the donkey. It's always a game, and can always, incidentally, be mathematically co-opted into game theory. Incidentally, one of the great forerunners of developing possibilities of game theory was John Maynard Keynes, who knew a lot about probability. And his work was carried on by John von Neumann. And one can go into game theory mathematically very deeply. Game theory in the 1990s becomes very refined in a thing called knot theory, K-N-O-T. Knots are very interesting in terms of differential mathematics. But the really consummate artist, the actor who portraying such and such a role in such and such a production so completely that they are that character, and yet they notice that so-and-so in the audience is doing such and such at the very same time. It doesn't interfere with the role on the differential level. If you were still in the integral cycle, you would have to be immersed in your participation. Your experience would have to flow parallel to nature. And nature would absorb your experience perfectly, and you would blend in exactly. The artist never blends in exactly. They're not concerned with participating with nature. They're not concerned with matching correspondently to existence. What is the flow for them that they're participating in is the flow of a mythic language of experience. For the artist, the nature that they participate in is experience. And the parallel to that experience is their vision. And when the vision now absorbs the experience, instead of experience being absorbed by nature, experience can conversely be absorbed by vision. Then the vision is primordial. Then its experience shows its ambidextrous nature. Experience can be completely absorbed into nature, but it can be also completely absorbed into vision. And when experience is completely absorbed into vision, you have a fruitful, nourishing context out of which the artist can emerge and be differentially there, like a prism, diffracting the entire spectrum of the energy that's there. And compose in such a way that couldn't even be dreamed of before. But this opening process is compromised to the extent that on mythic level, one still is thinking in terms, one's still experiencing in terms of representation. It surfaces as quickly as someone looking at a work of art says, oh, well, what does that represent? You have to go back to square sub one. It doesn't represent anything. You can make it represent something. You can make something up. That's the beginning of a sociological list that really has a lot to say about you, but not about so-and-so. That you see in your mind Grand Prix race cars when you listen to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony doesn't say a thing about Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. It's all about you. He never drove in the Grand Prix. He might have, but I had never heard of anyone that saw him drive in the Grand Prix. Those kinds of ersatz associations are all based not upon an image base, but upon an association base. So the association base becomes like a sludge that covers the true image base. And one has to do a lot of work sometimes to be able to go in and restore that ecology so that instead of your experiencing yourself in terms of the mud of association, that you really have the image base of your actual comportment to nature arbitrated by your actual body. The body, your body as your body. In a very realistic way, the artistic person is free to emerge to the extent that one's body gives its objectivity over. This character, which registers in this body, agrees to give that prerogative to the artist, to that person, the differential person. In between the objectivity of the body and the objectivity of the artist, person, is the objectivity of the mind. But the mind in its actual objectivity vanishes into its central focus. One of the qualities of the mind, when one really is able to let the mind think a la mind, not of any content, but as its own objective structure, it thinks itself to precision. And its precision is the exact vanishing center of its own activity. One of the things that characterizes the art of Max Ernst and of Kandinsky is the way in which the great artists of the 20th century have remembered or relearned those ancient Paleolithic qualities. Because men and women some 30,000 years ago already knew this, already understood this. They didn't use this kind of language to talk about it, but their art discloses that that's what was real for them. One sees in one of the earliest of all of the Paleolithic caves, the Chauvenet cave from about 27,000 years ago. Cave discovered and explored in the late 1980s. One sees already in the art of that cave the appearance of the hand, and the hand is given its play freely upon the composition of the animal world that was there as the sustaining ritual comportment. In Paleolithic times, some 27,000, 30,000, 35,000 years ago, the body, the ritual body, that was the objectivity of the integral cycle of life, was there in the animal population. The animal. The body was at home existentially in the animal realm. And man's hand playing on that, the human hand playing on that in outline, is an abstraction out of that realm into an objectivity which is personal. Even deeper than having a signature which you write your name as a language is your hand. Your hand. Your handprint. That's your signature. The artist has his hand and his eye and his mind, and those working together in a focus express that focus as the art that comes out of that, whatever it is that one is doing. I want to conclude today with Karen Kandinsky's little phrase that we started with. We started with a line. Let's go back to the point. Here's what Kandinsky writes about the point. Remember, the line began with the geometric line is an invisible thing. It's the point when it moves. Here's how it begins. The geometric point is an invisible thing. Therefore, it must be defined as an incorporeal thing. Considered in terms of substance, it equals zero. Hidden in this zero, however, are various attributes which are human in nature. We think of this zero, the geometric point, in relation to the greatest possible brevity, i.e., to the highest degree of restraint which nevertheless speaks. Thus we look upon the geometric point as the ultimate and most singular union of silence and speech. The geometric point has, therefore, been given its material form. In the first instance, in writing, it belongs to language and signifies silence. In the flow of speech, the point symbolizes interruption, non-existence, a negative element, and at the same time forms a bridge from one existence to another, a positive element. So this can be presented in a phrase. I believe that the phrase was used by André Malraux as the title of one of his books in the 1920s, The Voice of the Silence. When one can hear your voice out of your silence, one is ready then to be the artist that you are. It is both your voice and your silence, not only at one and the same time. It's not that those two ones come together in a correlation of representation, but that they occur together, paired, as a tuning fork. It's not that the two elements of the tuning fork are bent and then come together. Their operativeness is that they are a pair and that they don't become congruent, that they don't need to be bent to represent one or the other, but that in their pairedness they're able to vibrate. A tuning fork has a particular sound, and it's the sound of the interval, the space of that pair. Thus, there's a whole set of tuning forks. A piano tuner comes in with a set of tuning forks by which he tunes each string. And if you have a set of 8 tuning forks, one can tune an entire octave. And one can raise that octave or lower that octave by certain keys. And if you have a series, a sequence of those octaves in a certain number of keys, 11, then one has a piano. It's like that. Spiritual beings like ourselves are tunable. It's not that we have one note from one tuning fork. It's not even that we're just one clear set of tuning forks to an octave, nor a sequence of octaves that would make us into a musical instrument. We have all of the musical instruments imaginable within our spiritual person. So that an orchestra of several spiritual beings is just simply a matter of musical infinities of you take this for a while and I'll take that, and we could all do it all. That's what Yevtushenko heard when he was sent home to contemplate being bad vis-a-vis the Communist Party in Bratskaya Station. He said, "Oh, everything. Everything, everything, everything." And he never had to go back to the Soviet Union. He was the first Siberian who never had to go back to the Soviet Union. And so powerful was that vision that eventually the Soviet Union crumbled and fell before Yevtushenko did. The spiritual being literally outlives the illusion of the nightmare, no matter how large it seems. There was a time when one could have said that the size and permanence of the Soviet Union dwarfed Yevtushenko, and yet by 1991 it was Yevtushenko as an artist who dwarfed the Soviet Union, which became increasingly just a historical little blip on the Russian landscape. And in 1,000 years will be an unsightly little footnote in some rather grand spiritual history, in which somebody like a Kandinsky will be much more important than a Lenin, in which a Chagall will be ever so much more written about than a Stalin. And no one ever will have even remembered there was a person named Brezhnev. Even the demons in hell don't care. More next week.